This is part 2 of The Blank Canvas by O.G. Rose. We've already talked about the thought experiment of the blank canvas, how art, aesthetics, and philosophy relate, the necessity of information sources to determine the rational. And now we're going to really focus in on the distinction between aesthetic and art, which will get us into Plato's cave, the role of visions, the role of dialectics as a method to meaningfully define philosophy from thinking, and some more. Section 3, we're going to make a distinction between aesthetics and art, where all art are aesthetics, but not all aesthetics are art. We said earlier that we would make this distinction, and it's going to be important here. We also noted earlier that there are these three categories, the truth, what we think is true, the truth of material facticity, and also what could be true. In this last category is where art is going to be so important, because once the movie Inception is made, for example, Christopher Nolan's masterpiece, it is now possible for me to receive information about a possible world. Before that movie existed, I couldn't decide rational action relative to the movie Inception. Someone had to make it. And once somebody made that movie, once Christopher Nolan made that movie, it could then be rational, say, to try to invent the technology in that movie, or to tell my friends about that movie, or to think about time differently. So the movie Inception, once it was created, transformed what I could consider rational to do. So art expands the horizons of what could be true. And this is quite interesting, where it seems to be different from aesthetics, say the example of the bookcase. Well, actually the bookcase is made by people, and the movie Inception is made by people. So even though I mentioned the movie Inception, the bookcase is created by people. And mainly when I'm talking about art, I want to talk about aesthetic experiences that would not exist if humans didn't exist. And the bookcase wouldn't be there without people, nor would the movie Inception. But there seems to be a critical difference between the movie Inception or the bookcase and, say, a rock on the beach. A rock on the beach is an aesthetic experience, but it would have been there if humans would have never existed. Whereas the movie Inception would have never come into existence without humans. And in other pieces, I make a distinction between inanimate objects and inanimate objects with the in parentheses. So it's this sort of inanimate objects that only comes into existence because of an animate human being. So it's a mixture of those two categories. So what's interesting about art is humans can create it. It wouldn't arise in nature. And then once we create art, that art can then be a new source of information that organizes our rationality in new ways. So in other works, I also talk about the difference between the truth and the absolute, with an allusion to Hegel, with the truth being everything that is the case, to allude to Wittgenstein, and the absolute, which is tied to absolute knowing in Hegel, which Cadell and I discussed after last. The absolute is everything that is the case plus us. So it's the subject experiencing everything that is the case, which is then changing everything that is the case, which is then changing the subject, on and on. Well, the very existence of art seems to be evidence that the absolute is more of a description of human reality than just the mere truth, even if the absolute entails the truth. So I'm not saying that the truth doesn't matter at all. It's encompassed into the absolute. It's just that the absolute also takes seriously the subject. Well, the fact that humans can create art, therefore thus arise to new sources of information for their rationality, means that Hegel's absolute seems to be the correct way to understand our experience in the world. And also this understanding of how art expands the sources of our rationality, sources of information for our rationality, also starts to shed light on why someone like Harold Bloom is correct when he says that Shakespeare invented the human, or made us more human, which is a really weird claim until we start to understand that once Hamlet is invented, once Othello is created, there is now a new source of information for us to determine who we can become like, and determine what is rational or irrational relative to that goal. So it starts to make a little more sense. Once the movie Blade Runner is made, once some of the cyberpunk films are made, Akira, different things, then that is a new source of information that can change what we think is rational to do. But you see, since the moment Hamlet is created, and it's now possible for me to be like Hamlet, or to think of myself as in light of Hamlet, that can introduce a lack, a missing out, because I can see that I'm not Hamlet. In the same way that I can see I am not living in a world like the movie Ghost in the Shell, or living in a world like Inception, which can make life feel boring. So art, in precisely an increasing possibility, can simultaneously introduce a feeling of loss, and again, if we conflate possibility and freedom, which again, earlier we noted that reductions in possibility actually increase freedom, which is such a strange paradox. But if we make that conflation, then we're really not going to understand how art increases rationality and freedom, because the introduction of art, new possibility, can bring with it a feeling of lack. So once the movie Inception is made, we have a new source of information which can give us a new way to organize our rationality. So art is a unique unique evidence for the existence of freedom and free will, but since it introduces also a feeling of lack, that freedom can feel like it is not there. It can actually feel like we're missing it. So art increases the possibilities of what could be true. So again, we've established that the aesthetic is what makes possible rationality in a meaningful way, and now we have established that art is what expands the horizons of what could be true. It is a kind of aesthetic experience that only exists because humans exist, and in this way we can see that humanity has the possibility of expanding his or her own horizons freely, thus increasing the possibilities and the horizons of humanity's rationality. Section 4 is going to discuss Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and I have been talking about that a lot recently, inspired by Johannes. And in a recent reading of the Allegory, Johannes said the line, talking about the prisoners who were chained, watching the shadows on the walls. He recited the line, "They would be bound to think so," regarding if the shadows were real or not. And the line really struck me. They would be bound to think so. It's an interesting play on words, because they're bound, meaning they're chained and forced to watch, but they're also bound to think the shadows are real because it's all they've ever known, in the same way they would be bound to think that the prisoner who left the cave and came back and told them about the upper world, they'd be bound to think that prisoner was crazy, because relative to what they've always seen, due to being chained, that would be the case. They would be bound to think so, that the prisoner who went to the upper world was crazy, and that the shadows were real. Well, if there was no art, we would be bound to think according to whatever was the case. If there was no art, if we didn't have the ability to create beyond to create new aesthetic experiences beyond what was the case, then we would likewise be bound to think according to whatever was the case. Another way to put this is, if we were incapable of creating new things, bookcases, the movie Inception, so on and so forth, anything that wouldn't exist if humanity didn't exist, then there would be no absolute. There would only be the truth, kind of practically speaking. There would only be everything that was the case. We couldn't expand everything that was the case to similarly expand the horizons of our rationality. Our rationality would be bound to think according to whatever was the case. Reality would be like Plato's cave, and that would be that. But art is the act by which humanity can change its horizons and not be bound in the same way. The paper will talk about the difference between holding and being bound. In the holding will be in allusion to Mr. Singstock and Zaruba's conversation. Art gives us a way to hold our lives, hold reality, and to expand it, to expand the world, as opposed to simply being bound to think a certain way relative to whatever the world happened to be, and whatever the aesthetic experiences were that would be provided by existence. Aesthetics are what make philosophy possible, as I hope this paper has established, while art is what makes new philosophy possible. And so, considering this, we can view the prisoner who leaves the cave as carrying out an artistic act. This individual For one is standing up. And I'm going to be talking about here also the prisoner who nobody comes for. The paper, How Does Anyone Leave Plato's Cave, is going to ask the question, how do we leave the cave, and make distinctions between the prisoner who's dragged out, but also the thought experiment of the first prisoner who must have somehow escaped on their own because nobody could have come to get them. So we're going to be talking about that second prisoner. And that prisoner had to have done something. There must have been an aesthetic experience, movement, standing up, getting out of the prison. But then the prisoner would have also had to carry out the aesthetic experience of leaving the cave. And remember, all art is an aesthetic experience, even though not all aesthetics are art. So again, we can view the prisoner who leaves the cave as carrying out an artistic act. In the same way that whoever creates art expands the horizons of what we are bound to think. And so we're not bound to think because we can expand reality, so we can expand our horizons. But again, there's a sense in which we're bound because whenever we expand horizons, we experience them as still entailing certain limits. And that's why it's so difficult to realize that we're free, because it always brings with it lacks or new kinds of restrictions, new kinds of bindings, and, of course, a loss of potential, as we've been discussing. Well, considering all this, what's really interesting is thought, therefore, is the cave. The cave all the prisoners are bound in is, in fact, made of thought. The prisoners are looking at shadows. They are playing a memorization game. It is not the case that the prisoners who don't leave the cave do not think. They just don't think in a philosophical way. And what is meant by that is what we'll get into in the next sections. The prisoner who leaves the cave carries out an artistic act. They go outside of thought to make possible a new kind of thinking. It's not that the prisoner who leaves the cave is someone who thinks while no one else does. Is that the person who leaves the cave doesn't merely think. They do something beyond thinking, beyond what they are bound to do, to expand their horizons, to think about new things, to increase their information sources, which is to say they do something aesthetic, and more pressingly, something artistic. So it's really important for us to realize that the cave is in fact made of thought. That it is not that those in the cave don't think while those who leave the cave do think, that it is much more complex. The philosopher is a person of action and experience, not merely thought, and the possibilities of action are relative to aesthetics and art. So the philosopher is not merely someone who thinks, but someone who thinks in a different way, as we'll get into. Section 5 will pick up from 4, which left us with the idea that the person who leaves the cave is thinking differently from the people who stay in the cave. And the person who leaves, who Plato associates with the philosopher king and the philosopher, is thinking according to dialectics, which dialectics is philosophy, basically. It is the method of philosophy, in a similar way that science is the scientific method. It's really important to realize that one engages in philosophy not so much because they think about mind, free will, the nature of reality. These are all philosophical subjects. But that's not necessarily doing philosophy unless you carry out a certain method. In the same way that I can think about quantum mechanics, general relativity, chemistry, the subjects of science, but that would not make me a scientist unless I go into the lab, do the experiments, and follow the scientific method. The difference between what makes science is a method. In the same way that what makes philosophy is a method, and that method is dialectics. And dialectics is this going back and forth between different premises, trying to undermine them, to think a thought, then to find evidence for why it's wrong. And also critically, dialectics entails going back and forth between things that are ontologically different in kind. And therefore, philosophy requires this distinction between, in order for philosophy to be itself, it actually requires the distinction between thought and the aesthetic, between thinking and experience. Far from the aesthetics and art being a threat and opposite of philosophy, they are what make it possible. Because the philosopher is not someone who simply sits around and thinks. That's what the people in the cave do. The people who don't leave the cave just sit around and think. The philosopher gets up and walks out. There's something else going on. There's something aesthetic. There's experience. We have this classical idea that the philosopher is a man sitting on a stone with his fist under his chin. That's the complete opposite. That is a depiction of the people who stay in the cave, the one who sits on a rock and think. That's what the people who stay in the cave do, not what the philosopher does. The philosopher does something. They act, and thus form a dialectic in their thinking between thought and action, between true and rational, as I've stressed throughout the work. Bad philosophers aren't active and hardly any different from mere thinkers, like that man on a rock. In the name of truth, they discard the aesthetic where truth is found. Thinking keeps us in the cave. That's why I was saying that the cave can be understood as thinking, as a result of thinking, while dialectics lead us out. So it's really, really critical that we understand that philosophy is primarily a method, a dialectical method, and that thinking doesn't necessarily get us out of the cave. In fact, it could be the very reason we stay in the cave if we are not using the dialectical method. If in order for that man in that famous statue who's sitting on a rock to be a philosopher, he needs to have walked to where he sits down. He needs to have carried out an act to get to the place where he thinks. It is active thinkers per se who can be philosophers because they can be dialectical, while passive thinkers who are just sitting there taking in the shadows and thinking about them are not philosophers, and yet they are still thinkers. So it's really critical to understand that leaving Plato's cave is not merely the difference between thinking and not thinking, but the difference between thinking and dialectical thinking. And finally, section 6, which will stress the idea that we don't really question thoughts by thinking about them, for our new thoughts would likely prove captured by our old thoughts and make little difference. In order for thinking to really advance, it has to be dialectically relating to action and the aesthetic and experience. Again, once we separate philosophy from the aesthetic, we basically doom philosophy to not really even be philosophy, because it cannot be dialectic, and philosophy then becomes difficult to define from mere thinking, or maybe even intense thinking, because I can think really hard about quantum mechanics and never be a scientist because I never use the scientific method, in the same way that people can think really hard and really deeply even about, say, free will or the nature of reality, but since they never introduce a dialectic, they won't be doing philosophy. So it's quite critical for us to deconstruct this idea that philosophy and the aesthetics are opposed, that thinking and experience are opposed, because in fact they are experience. That dialectic is what makes philosophy possible. So again, the philosopher is not a man on a rock with a fist under his chin. In fact, the thinking man is the prisoner in Plato's cave. If all we do is think, then all we can think about is what is presented to us, which is what we will be bound to think about, to reference Johannes again. The philosopher, the philosopher, unlike the mere thinker who's bound to think relative to whatever is thrown in front of them, is more like an artist, seeking the aesthetic, a view of the sun outside of Plato's cave, so that his or her thinking may forever be changed by the experience. The philosopher is an active thinker, while the prisoners in the cave simply think about what is presented to them. Again, the action, aesthetics, and experience processed through dialectics is the activity of philosophy, and the means all philosophy. And this means that all philosophy entails thinking, but it is not the case that all thinking is philosophy. The difference is that dialectic, and critically, philosophers seek new sources of thought, like artists looking for inspiration, while thinkers simply accept whatever sources are given, and this means philosophers seek aesthetics and art. And look, you go to read Heidegger, you go to talk to people about deep subjects, you go and take walks to think about subjects, you go to foreign places to have experiences. All of these are actions. All of these require doing things. Reading a book is a kind of action. Having a conversation with other people concerned about the nature of reality is a kind of action. And philosophers who don't read, people who try to do philosophy who don't read books, who don't go to foreign places, who don't go beyond their comfort zones, tend to be very bad philosophers, which tends to, but if our idea of the philosopher is just simply someone who thinks, there shouldn't be a correlation between someone's willingness to do the actions of reading, experience, maybe trying a sport, things like that, and their ability to think well. But it actually turns out to be the case that philosophy is not mere thinking, but a kind of dialectical thinking between experience and thought, where the aesthetic and philosophy go together. Critically also, I think it should just be noted that the philosopher escapes the tyranny of thought through dialectics. There's a kind of tyranny to thinking, because thinking tries to bind us to what is given, to what we've always thought. Thinking is what convinces the people in the cave that the shadows are real. They would not believe the shadows are real in the cave unless they thought. So there's a kind of tyranny to thinking, and it will indeed bind us to a certain ideological disposition that we are born into, or a certain map, to use language from the third book in the trilogy of The Truism and the Rational. So there's a kind of tyranny to thought that it's always trying to capture us. One of the beauties of dialectics is it keeps thinking from becoming too big and too unified and from capturing us. It breaks up thought into smaller parts, questions it. It keeps a single thought from becoming so big and all-encompassing that we cannot escape it. It fights monotheism, as I like to call it, in favor of polytheism. So there's a sense in which we can say, in the same way that, I guess, federalism in American political science keeps the government from being too big, but also acknowledges that the government is necessary, that it's a quote-unquote necessary evil. In the same way, dialectics is a kind of federalism of thinking. It keeps a single thought or a single collection of thoughts from being so powerful that it controls us entirely. In the way that it does that is to always keep us open to experience, to the aesthetic, and to the new horizons that art can open up. There's a sense in which the philosopher transforms the tyrant of thought, per se, into an artist, from a dictator who keeps us trapped to a dictator orally reciting a story to be written. And if we don't carry out this philosophical act, there is a very real sense in which our thinking will be a kind of tyrant that binds us to a cave of itself, of its own thoughts. So if we don't engage in dialectics, thinking is what keeps us in the cave. And yet what's so terrible is if we think that thinking is how we escape the cave, then the very fact we're thinking will give us reason to think that we're escaping the cave, when all we're doing is what everyone does, because everyone thinks. So it's really important that we understand that thought and action and experience and the aesthetics and art, all of these things are linked together. Otherwise, we're going to fall a victim to the tyrant of our own thinking. So in the same way that it's kind of interesting, because the prisoner who leaves Plato's cave is kind of inspired by a vision, right? A vision of the sun, a vision of the stars, a vision of the outside world. They're very similar to the artist who's inspired by a vision to create something like Inception, to create something that holds books better, like a bookcase, to create War and Peace, to create a self-driving car. Artists are compelled by visions in the same way philosophers are compelled by visions of ways that we can understand freedom and determinism working together, that we can understand mind and brain working together, that we can understand different vectors interrelating, to allude to Ilung's work. Philosophers operate according to visions in the same way that artists operate according to visions, and yet we have traditionally for a very long time associated philosophers and artists as being opposites, when both of them operate according to visions and are compelled by those visions. And it is these visions of which make both of them dialectical, because the artist is always in the world but not of it. They're in the world trying to pay the bills, trying to get by, but they're also not of it because they're trying to write their books, and their metrics for success don't tend to be determined by the world but by their own inner compass. This is very similar, tends to happen with philosophers. They're trying to get by, they're trying to pay their bill, they're in the world, but they're not of it because they're trying to think of horizons that have not yet been realized, new possibilities that go beyond what is presented. Both the artist and the philosopher attempt to be people who are not bound to think, but whom instead think for themselves. And if we take seriously that vision is how we keep ourselves from being bound to the cave, then it makes sense to say that where there is no vision, a people perish. This has been O.G. Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.